Welcome, my name is Dan Vera. Blue room. Begin with a clean table, as clean as you can make it. Remove the labels of the bottle, the fancy French lavender jar. Remove any reminders of someone else's time here. Try to clear as much out of the way. Let yourself be rooted in your own story, which will slowly include the story of this desk by the window with its singular view of the passing cloud and perhaps a prairie beyond, the green grass with a sculpture of white wood in the shape of an upturned cup. Everything will become its own kind of belonging. Surrender to associations that flutter through your mind. Let this place be a solace of sorts, with its comforting warmth and newness. The shabby chair that awaits your sitting. The books whose spines you will finger some obstinate afternoon when you press for a point to make on the page. All of this is yours for a time, to make use of, to lean back into, like a sort of home for your wandering. I decided to read poems that were written in residency. There's an experience about being at home and being left to write and dealing with sort of confined spaces that kind of reminded me of other experiences in other places, trying to create and trying to reflect. And this poem is titled October 8th, 1582, and it begins with an epigraph, which is about the year 1582. Because of the implementation of the Gregorian calendar, this day does not exist in this year in Italy, Poland, Portugal, and Spain. What a day that was, that one they still whisper about. No one's quite sure what day it was. A Tuesday, some say, others say Thursday. We filled up on cakes and latkes while the barrels went running. No wars on that day, no angry fights or brawls of any kind, just loving in the sheets and the largest meals we could remember. Thanks to Gregor, who told us to ignore the sun arcing across the sky. When the day closed, we all stood outdoors, gazing at the fading light. There will never be a sunset quite like this one, some said. And they, of course, were right. So there's something about, I know, in this kind of period, to be sort of limited in the number of people you see and to suddenly realize just kind of the longing to sort of touch and to see and to maybe hear live voices. I'm fortunate to have someone to spend this with and a dog to sort of help me get out of my own human thought processes. So some of these poems are really about that kind of narrowing down of experience. Cosmic reach. Like in one of those Oliver Sacks movies, time slows as I reach for you. You go on, live your life, age, forget me, my arms still reaching out. I spend 40 years in that fraction of a minute, my arms stretching out to touch your face. This is it in some other dimension I slipped into. We kept living our life, lying in bed, walking the dog, going on vacations in my mind. But my arms still trapped in that half second. physicists call it a temporal junction loop, or the physicist in my movie does. Somewhere beneath a mountain, in a test chamber, they slow the gases of a rare earth element and find a flicker of my longing, trapped in that span of time. Maybe even the earth extinguishes itself, and the reach continues. Who's to know? Sleep in the bed, walk the dog, take the vacation. The reach continues, longing to touch your face. Naked lover flossing. He's standing in front of the mirror, talking through his morning routine when my lingering gaze gets his attention. He smiles, and I tell him I'm thinking of a poem. Naked lover flossing. Great title, isn't it? Sounds like an obscure literary magazine, he says, or the name of a punk band. On the way to the bed, he steps over the speed bump of a dog and begins to get his clothes on. Maybe they're the random bits of English on a Japanese schoolgirl's book bag, he says. It's probably too unlikely for a spam message, I ask. Yeah, because it's really not selling anything, he says. Except to me, I think. Except to me. Except to me, I think. Except to me. Hazard of pairs. Like sixes and sevens, he says, carrying an old phrase to the present from an old game in London town where hands threw dice against a wall. Hazard, they called it, to chance for the riskiest pair and play for the rare cinq et six from the French for 5 and 6. Or did he mean Chaucer's play, where Troilus and Cresside set the world on 6 and 7 and risked to hazard the world? If we were Chinese, we could be Qi Shang Ba Sha, Shi Shang Ba Sha, 7 above and 8 below. Nothing but adjective. This poem is about one of my favorite painters, Charles Demuth. He was a precisionist painter. He's kind of famous for a number of his pieces, but he also did these meticulously, these beautiful flowers, kind of close-up flowers. He's sort of a contemporary of O'Keeffe, but his are very different. And he was rather openly gay for his period. He's also very famous for these beautiful paintings of bathhouses in New York. These nudes kind of just sort of painted from the memory of the setting. So people either know him for one of some of those paintings, the florals, or they know him for the nudes. Anyway, he was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where my husband's from, and I've had a chance to sort of visit the library, the house that he grew up in and that he died in. He died there, and anyway, that's pretty much it. It begins with an epigraph. One of my favorite lines of his, Demuth. There is a crusade against vice in Lancaster, and I'm going home to speak for vice. Charles Demuth. Sugar, vein, flower, lover, you arose from your mother Augusta's garden to draw the world precise and alive, the perfect geometry of this city, its factory lines abstracted, the pulsing curves of tulip and apple, red cabbage and rhubarb, the revelation of warmer flowers in the baths of New York, the mystical code of numbers and sky, everything always alive in you. Deem, what amiable laugh did you have to charm the bitterest artist heart? Even Georgia the Scowl loved you, and William Carlos was smitten by your generosity. You are all but forgotten now, even on the brick streets of the city you returned to, where you spent your last days with a needle and the brush. At King and Duke Streets, your house is a museum now, Your watercolors, blossoms of petal and flesh, hang in sight of Augusta's Victorian flowered rose, the fruit, the vegetable, the silo, the cityscape in the front room, the nudes in the darkest corners, standing as you found them, gleaming in their wet caverns of joy. And this was written for a friend of mine who lives in the Bay Area, lives in San Francisco, but for many years spent time in Northern Virginia as a contract worker. And it's based on an anecdote he told me about what he decided to do with his I don't know, his weekly coffee money. I just love the image of the transformation he begat at AOL. I believe it was at AOL headquarters. This is titled Balanesia in Suburbia. Praise Coco, born Bruce, who every week bought an orchid for his cell, between the elevator and the boardroom, who misted them meticulous, and thus transformed suburbia into Balanesia. Everyone knew Bruce for the ways he broke forth from blandness, with the spotted cowls of Phalaenopsis, Cymbidium's striped fingers, and the purple mouths of Dendrobium, all of them poring over the cubbyholes of work life. Praise what resided in Coco to know, what could love a light fluorescent and make the stale air bloom with hue. One of the experiences of this COVID closure has been, death has been losing so many people. And some weeks ago, we lost a great writer, someone I knew not very well, but who I appreciated so much. I knew him, and most of the world knew him as H.G. Carrillo. He was the author of a wonderful memoir called Losing My Spanish that I really loved. His death shocked me, and I grieved it. I grieved losing the opportunity to spend more time with him. Something I should have spent, you sort of kind of, when someone dies, it's one of the things you lament, the lost opportunity. I was glad as a gay writer, I was glad that this great gay writer was remembered in obituaries in the Windy City Times in Chicago, the gay paper there, and then also in the Washington Post. And then a few days later, the Washington Post ran a correction in which they discovered that he in fact was not, or his birth name was not H.G. Carrillo. He was born Herman Glenn Carroll in Detroit. He wasn't Latino. He wasn't Cuban American. I'm Cuban American. My parents came from Cuba in the early 60s. And he had created this entire identity. And it was a shock, continues to be a shock to the many people who knew him. And so I kind of wanted to write sort of a piece that's it's a little bit more kind of reflective about sort of my thought process around Acha's death. I still call him Acha because that's how he was known. And regardless of the particularities of taking another group's identity, he chose that name and he wanted to be known by that name, so I refer to him as Acha. This is titled Tabula Rasa, Fabula Rasa. What do you make of his confusion? Something he saw in the experience that reminded him of his own. The one thing, the one thing alone, as if any identity could hold. As if any identity could hold all the questions, the unanswered questions your parents posed by your parents, an inheritance of unknowing, added to the layers surrounding the flora and fauna with their mysterious names, the household cosmologies with their household gods at every threshold. From another landscape of knowing, this way the exile continues, from one to the arrival, from the arrival to the risen, the bereft and the rootless wandering. I don't have a story, my friends, students would tell her. I have no flavor. National blandness in constant search of the shock of some semblance of belonging in the face of those fluent in foreign shores, more rooted in the deeper gravities of soil and season, the rhythmic weavings of conquest and loss and exhaustion and departure. Who is more Cuban, the Detroit-born Glenn or the Texas-born Dan? We hold our lineages sacred, even if we can't feel the lines anymore. Something in the story resided inside of him, more claimed by diligence, by the multiple measures of history. In the end, we gather whatever wood will warm us. And I want to close with a poem, a love poem. This poem is, if I can find it, is titled For Pete. Here we are at 20, my trusted hand, my heart and ribbon twin. No words were in my boyhood heart for a promise like you. Living in fear for lack of this, no water, no quench for chapped lips. Stories were told in farther parts, but I had no ears for such whispers. My name was either silence or a curse, written in some earlier illuminated script. Still, the heart speaks in capillary action, swims for a greater stream. You, my current and rivulet. No future, nothing but experience, years living with someone else's words, praying to someone else's God, until the day I spied you across a table, while you paid attention to later ask me what were the poets I spoke of as we walked along a strange city's streets. Those were the first hours of our life together, held aloft in each other's caress. Then a year of longing for you. The very idea of finding you is pure alien calculus. And yet we did. And I, who hold no belief in heavens or order, must admit to the symmetry of your arm around my shoulder, the way your laughter breaks me open like a lock to a key. In my stifling years of aloneness, I would repeat the Upanishad, that all was emptiness, and that emptiness was everything. And yet in the barren stone, you rose like a blue flower, the sky seeded in the earth to rise like a miracle. I will create a chapel to that miracle alone. No religion holds a greater thing than what I know from daily word. You are good, and here, and mine. I know nothing more to be true than this. Thank you. Thank you.